In Istanbul last night, demonstrators clashed with police, defying a government ban on protest.
What happens when the empire that once ruled continents starts stumbling on its own streets? This is Turkey in 2025. Turkey today is facing a convergence of pressures unlike anything in its modern history. What makes the current moment so striking is not a single crisis in isolation, but the way multiple vulnerabilities now overlap, reinforce, and accelerate one another. Recent assessments show that 92.9% of key national indicators are classified as high or critical risk. It means that nearly every pillar of the country's stability, economic, political, social, and geopolitical, is under strain at the same time. For years, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan crafted the image of an unstoppable leader. Mega projects, new mosques, defiant speeches that shook the halls of NATO and echoed across the Middle East. But behind the show of power, the foundations are crumbling. The Lira is in free fall. Inflation has hollowed out wages, foreign investors have packed their bags, and a generation of young Turks are leaving, convinced their future lies anywhere but home. At the same time, the arrest of Istanbul's mayor, a rival with real popular support, has triggered demonstrations of the unrest of a decade ago. But only now it's getting deeper. Turkey still holds NATO's second largest army. It still controls a strategic crossroads between Europe and the Middle East. But can a country so central to the world's balance hold itself together when its own foundations are shaking? Let's see. So Turkey has officially entered a technical recession in 2025, with GDP contracting by 0.2% for 2 consecutive quarters. This marks a significant turning point for the economy, which had managed to avoid recession during earlier global shocks such as the pandemic and regional conflicts. What makes the current downturn more concerning is that it comes despite years of aggressive monetary interventions and repeated promises of a new economic model. But inflation remains a pressure point. Although it has eased from its record highs above 80% in 2022, current levels fluctuating between 37.9% and 48.6%. Continue to erode household purchasing power and create uncertainty for businesses. The Turkish lira, already one of the worst performing emerging market currencies, has lost another 20% of its value in the past year, sliding to 39.53 per US dollar. Also, projections suggest further depreciation is likely, with some forecasts pointing to an exchange rate approaching 79 lira per USD by 2030 if structural reforms are not implemented. Also, signs of financial system strain are becoming increasingly visible. Non-performing loans rose to 425 billion as of June 2025, a 48% surge in just 6 months and the highest level seen in half a decade. This rise reflects growing challenges faced by businesses and households in meeting debt obligations. And in parallel, the Ministry of Justice reported nearly 26 million enforcement files opened in the first half of 2025 alone, indicating widespread defaults and repayment disputes that have now surpassed even the peaks recorded during the COVID-19 crisis. Monetary policy has done little to stabilize expectations. The central bank has also kept benchmark interest rates at 50% in an effort to rein in inflation and defend the currency. Yet the policy stance has had a dual effect. While high borrowing costs have sharply reduced domestic consumption and investment, they have not succeeded in anchoring confidence in the lira or easing price pressures. This has created a feedback loop in which weak demand, rising costs, and persistent currency depreciation reinforce one another, making recovery more difficult. Also, the arrest of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu in March 2025 has ignited the largest wave of protests. Turkey has witnessed this for more than a decade. What began as outrage over the detention of a single political figure has quickly evolved into a broader movement, drawing hundreds of thousands into the streets of Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, and beyond. This sheer scale of the demonstrations point out a reality. Turkish society is no longer simply reacting to one arrest, but to years of democratic erosion and the steady consolidation of power under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. In the March 2025 local elections, the opposition Republican People's Party secured 37.8% of the national vote, narrowly surpassing the ruling Justice and Development Party, which received 35.5%. While the margin may seem small, its significance is historic. It marks the first time since 2002 that Erdogan's party has been defeated in a nationwide contest at the ballot box. For over 2 decades, the AKP maintained a firm grip on Turkish politics, positioning itself as the dominant force across municipalities, parliament, and the presidency. Now, with the CHP's resurgence, the foundations of that dominance appear less stable. If you're enjoying this deep dive, please like the video and consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more global insights. Now, back to the video. Many analysts argue that this momentum could carry into the 2028 presidential elections, setting the stage for an unprecedented challenge to Erdogan's leadership. But such momentum also introduces risks. With the government tightening its control over institutions, the judiciary, and the media, the space for opposition politics is narrowing. This raises the possibility of escalating confrontations between state security forces and a mobilized public. The arrest of İmamoğlu may have been the trigger, but the protests have exposed a Turkey split between an increasingly authoritarian state and a society demanding greater political freedoms. Also, fertility rates have fallen sharply to 1.48 children per woman, well below the replacement level of 2.1 required to sustain population growth. At the same time, the share of elderly citizens has risen, with 10.6% of the population now over the age of 65. Crossing the United Nations threshold for classification as a very aged society. By 2050, 1 in every 4 people in Turkey will be over 65, and by 2075 this will rise to 1 in 3. The speed of this demographic shift is particularly concerning because it is unfolding before Turkey has reached the income levels typically associated with advanced economies. This creates the so-called getting old before getting rich challenge, where the costs of supporting an aging population through pensions, healthcare, and social services could strain public finances and labor markets without the cushion of high national wealth. This imbalance may reduce economic dynamism, shrink the working-age population, and put additional pressure on younger generations, making demographic reform a central policy challenge for Turkey's future. Turkey now finds itself on the front lines of a deepening environmental emergency, one that is beginning to reshape both daily life and long-term survival prospects. Nearly 88% of the country's land is at high risk of desertification, an alarming figure that moves the issue from theoretical debate to lived reality. Reservoirs that once supplied millions are running dry, with storage levels plummeting to between 15% and 25% of capacity across key regions. In Ankara, the nation's political heart, major dams have dropped to just 15%, forcing authorities to introduce emergency water restrictions for households and businesses alike. The timing could hardly be worse. July 2025 registered a 71% decline in rainfall compared to the previous year, with some provinces suffering precipitation levels more than 95% below average. This is not a short-term anomaly, but part of a broader trend tied to climate change, land mismanagement, and relentless urban expansion. The consequences are immediate. Parched fields, dried riverbeds, and intensifying competition over shrinking water reserves. For a nation where nearly 1 in 5 workers is employed in agriculture, the water crisis carries economic as well as humanitarian implications. Staple crops such as wheat, barley, and corn face declining yields, threatening food security and driving up prices in already strained markets. Farmers, many of whom operate at the margins of profitability, face the impossible choice of abandoning land or taking on debt to sustain failing harvests. What makes this crisis particularly dangerous is its interconnectedness. Desertification undermines rural livelihoods, pushing migration toward already overstressed urban centers. Water scarcity fuels social discontent, particularly in regions where shortages compound existing political and economic frustrations. Taken together, Turkey's environmental decline risks becoming a force multiplier for instability. Not an isolated problem, but one that deepens every other challenge the country faces. Turkey is bleeding talent at an alarming pace. Every year, roughly 2% of its university graduates pack their bags and leave, an exodus that is striking hardest in the very fields the country needs most to stay competitive. Nearly 18% of molecular biology graduates, 10% of bioengineers, and over 8% of computer engineers are heading abroad, seeking opportunities they no longer believe exist at home. Their destinations tell a story. The United States takes in 21.4% of these high-skill immigrants, Germany 17.5%, and the United Kingdom 11.2%. For Turkey, this isn't just a brain drain, it's a brain hemorrhage. The drivers are familiar but devastating. Economic stagnation, shrinking political freedoms, and the suffocating sense that ambition has no outlet within Erdogan's increasingly repressive system. Each departure chips away at the country's innovative capacity and long-term growth prospects, leaving behind a hollowed-out future just when Turkey needs its brightest minds most. Turkey is spending more on defense than ever before, $47 billion in 2025. Yet even that record figure amounts to just 1.8% of GDP, below NATO's own 2% benchmark. On paper, it's a sign of underinvestment. In practice, it's a sign of overreach. The Turkish military is stretched across multiple fronts: Syria, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, and northern Cyprus, with the added risk of being pulled into the fallout of a potential Israel-Iran confrontation. Each deployment drains resources, while domestic unrest back home piles more strain on already thin fiscal margins. This mismatch between what Ankara spends and what it attempts to project abroad creates a paradox. A military that looks powerful, but operates on fragile economic foundations. Defense, in other words, is becoming one more pressure point in an economy already groaning under debt, inflation, and political turmoil. Research into Turkey's trajectory suggests three potential futures. Of these, the most likely is not renewal or reform, but the consolidation of autocracy. In this scenario, the last members of Turkey's democratic institutions are extinguished, opposition parties are weakened or outright suppressed, leaving no credible check on power. Foreign investors, wary of political instability and legal unpredictability, pull back. The result: capital flight, stagnant growth, and rising unemployment. As living conditions worsen, migration pressure builds, pushing more Turks toward Europe in search of opportunity and creating friction with Ankara's already strained Western partners. Meanwhile, cracks appear within the ruling coalition itself. Under extreme stress, even loyal factions may begin to fracture, eroding the internal cohesion that has long kept the system afloat. This convergence of crises, recession, repression, demographic decline, environmental stress, and brain drain is not a single threat, but a storm front. And storms do not simply batter, they overwhelm. For Turkey, it may prove the ultimate test of whether the state can hold itself together or whether the machinery of governance begins to seize under the sheer weight of pressure. The findings are stark. Out of Turkey's 14 key structural indicators, 6 register at critical severity, 42.9%, 7 at high severity, 50%, and only 1 at medium, 7.1%. In other words, 92.9% of Turkey's fundamental state functions are already operating in high-risk or near-failure conditions. This isn't the profile of a country navigating a difficult period, it's the profile of a system on the brink of structural failure. Unlike typical recessions or political disputes, the danger here is convergence. Economic decline feeds political repression. Repression drives brain drain undermines innovation, and environmental stress amplifies social unrest. Each crisis accelerates the others. Without immediate, coordinated reforms across economic policy, democratic governance, demographic renewal, environmental safeguards, and talent retention, Turkey risks sliding beyond recovery. The prospect is no longer just turbulence, it is the genuine possibility of state breakdown. And the window for effective action is narrowing rapidly. If you found this analysis valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into geopolitics. We would love to hear your thoughts. Drop your comments below and let us know what you think. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.